One of my friends recently had the opportunity to go to Israel in that area and do a little bit of archaeological digging. It was a trip that was kind of put together to allow some different people to do that. And when he came back, he gave me several shards of pottery. There were some from, I think, Shiloh, one from Jericho, a couple other places. And of course, me being the history nerd and the Bible nerd, if you want to call it that I am, I'm just thrilled, right? I get to see these things that date so far back and are from these very important places that were mentioned in Scripture. But it's interesting when we actually look at some of the, I guess if you want to say the science behind the archaeology, you constantly find pottery when you're doing those kind of digs. And the reason is because, we think today we have all this stuff made of plastic and silicone and all these kind of materials to make containers. Well, obviously they didn't have a lot of that, but they have dirt, right? They have access to clay that they can shape into various containers and use that for whatever purpose they need to use it for. So in ancient times, and when you're doing digs in ancient places, you are constantly going to find evidence of pottery, which means the people at that time are very familiar with the process of making pieces of pottery. I don't think it is a mistake then that, as we just read in Jeremiah and several other places, Isaiah, for example, also mentions this same illustration, that God uses the illustration of a potter making a vessel as something to try and convey a spiritual message to his people Israel. This is something they would have seen with their own eyes. Similar to how we think of Jesus using parables. We can imagine him gesturing toward a field where someone's sowing seed when he tells the parable of the sower. Same type of thing happening here in the Old Testament as he gives this illustration of the potter and the clay. Now, we're not going to focus in specifically, although it certainly would be an interesting study, on the context of what is happening in Israel in Jeremiah's day or Isaiah's day. What I instead want us to do this morning is I want us to take this illustration and break it down into three different elements of which pottery could be used, or in this case, pottery could function. I want us to use that. I want us to try and think about how that applies to you and I in the present day. You do certain things with a piece of pottery. You have to make it. You have to make it for a specific purpose and then hopefully use it for that purpose. But also, if you've ever dealt with anything that is pottery or adjacent to pottery, it's kind of fragile, isn't it? It's kind of breakable. So at times, you also have to repair it. And I want us to use all those ideas as we look in our study this morning. So first of all, as we think about this illustration of pottery and who is doing the shaping, let's think about who is shaping us. Using this illustration, we are the clay, and then there is a potter. Who is shaping us? Who is molding us? Who is doing what it takes to turn us into the finished product that we are going to be? I titled this sermon, Your Potter Matters, because while God describes himself as the potter, we sometimes as human beings can be very good at replacing him in that role. The potter takes this clay. It is just a lump. There's no form. There's no real structure or organization or order to it. And he begins, or she, depending on the situation, begins to mold this lump of clay into something useful, into something distinct. But isn't that true of life? When you're a child, what happens? In many ways, while yes, there's some things that are already there, there's genetics that are there are some basic things, but in many ways you're a blank slate when you come into this world, right? But what happens as you get older? You are shaped. You are molded. You are transformed into who you are going to be by the influences, by the people around you. Now, as a child, you don't really get a choice in that process, right? But sometimes we forget that once we become adults, that process is still going. We are still being shaped. We are still being molded into who we will be for however long we have that remains on this earth. But the difference is now we have a little bit of a choice in who we're allowing to shape us. So who is shaping us? I would submit to you, it matters. Solomon said, "Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." In other words, who you allow to be your influences, who you spend the most time with, they will shape who you are. They will have a say in the kind of person you not only currently are, but will continue to become. Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise. Now, that's not just osmosis, right? I don't know if any of you have ever said, when I'm studying for a test, I just want to hang around with a bunch of smart people and maybe you'll just rub off on me, right? Well, that's not quite how it works, and that's not really how it works this way too. Some of it can be passive, but I have to listen when I'm around good influences. I have to try and take what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing as an example and try and put it into practice. But there is some of that can rub off both in a positive and a negative way, right? The companion of fools will suffer harm. If I hang out with those who are making poor decisions, sometimes even whether I consciously realize it or not, it starts shaping me, doesn't it? I'm sure many of us can think of the example of Rehoboam. That's the first thing that comes to mind in this kind of idea. Rehoboam, the descendant of David, he is specifically the son of Solomon. He is inheriting by right the throne of Israel. Now, he has been raised by Solomon. We can already suspect there are probably some issues with that environment given Solomon's own moral failings. But once he gets to the age where he does have some choice, he has two sets of advisors, if you remember. He has young advisors who are raised with him, who have some of the same character traits as him, one of those being they're kind of dumb. And he has other advisors who advised his father before him, who are wise, who have knowledge, who have experience, and each gives counsel. The young men say, "Show him who's boss. You're the king now. You can do whatever you want." Make sure they know that. The older advisors, the wiser ones, the ones with more experience, they say, on the contrary, you need to recognize that you have an opportunity here to win the favor of the people, to win their loyalty. Of course, their advice is better. But Solomon has a choice, or rather, Rehoboam has a choice at this point. Who will he allow to shape him? Who will he take advice from? And of course, we know he chooses the foolish advice. As a result, he loses 5/6 of his kingdom. All because he made a poor choice of who would shape him, of who would have a say in who he was becoming. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, Paul would say in his second letter to the Corinthians. What partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? What fellowship has light with darkness? Now, people have gone to this passage for a lot of different reasons. For example, many have gone to this passage to try and talk about marriage and whether a Christian should marry a non-Christian. Well, I think that's relevant. That's certainly not the main idea that he's talking about. That's not the context of this passage. It's a much broader context. If you understand the concept of a yoke, we don't really do that much in the modern day anymore, at least not in America, but a yoke was something that would attach two animals together. This was something that allowed these two animals to work in harmony to where they are multiplying their efforts because of this link. And if you are going to yoke two animals together, they've got to match up well. They've got to be similar in their strength, similar in their capacity, similar in their speed. Or else what happens? They're yoked together, but they're constantly fighting each other. They're constantly going in two different directions. They have different goals. Now imagine, whatever the context of the relationship might be, if you are so closely linked to another human being that you are allowing them to pull you in a different direction in life than where you know you should be going, which is toward God. That's what Paul is talking about here. Am I choosing to draw so closely to another human being that I know does not have the same goal as I do in life? Well, what do you think that's going to do? Inevitably, that's going to pull me away from the path that I know I should be walking. I want us to consider just very briefly some of what this might look like. What does it look like when I am choosing what will shape me? Well, for example, we've already mentioned the people we're around. Now, God is very clear, right? Both in the Old and the New Testament, we do need to interact with those who are not following God. Because we are to be lights in the world. We are to be the salt of the earth. We're to be trying to bring them to Christ. We can't do that unless we interact. Christians are not supposed to be hermits. We're not supposed to be cultists. We're not supposed to be removed from the world. But there's a difference between trying to be a light to others and losing focus of our purpose so that, in fact, our light is being hidden. Our light is being dimmed by how we've allowed others to influence us. What is shaping you? Are you spending intentionally time around those who have that same goal? Or perhaps when you leave these four walls, is all of your time spent around those who don't have the same goal? It takes intentionality. Or perhaps we think about just what we put in our minds. You know, it's interesting. I was talking with a friend earlier this week about the 24-hour news cycle. There's something that's very interesting when that first was kind of invented. Yes, we want to have news going on 24/7, but you realize what happens when there's not just a whole lot of news to report on in a given 24 hours. Well, if we're going to have something, that means we've got to come up with something to throw in there. Well, what gets people's attention? Things that cause fear, things that cause anger. What are you allowing to shape you? Are you allowing your mindset, your life to be shaped by the news? Or to be shaped perhaps by celebrities or entertainment? Or we could list so many things. But we've got to understand, in a very real sense, we get to choose our potter. We get to choose the one who is shaping us, who is molding us, because as human beings, we're constantly moving forward. We're constantly, even in a sense, changing. That's the nature of life. So who is shaping that change? Are we spending time in the Word? Are we spending time putting things into our minds that are helping us grow in a specific direction? It matters who is shaping us. So we need to ask ourselves, who is it that we are allowing to have a say in the person we're becoming? But secondly, not only does it matter who shapes us, it matters who uses us. When you make a piece of pottery, it is meant for a purpose. It is designed to be used. It's not just designed to sit there. At least we're talking in the ancient world. Now, maybe today a lot of our pottery just kind of sits there. It looks pretty, right? Even that's a use, technically speaking. But especially in the ancient world, this is designed to hold something like water or wine or something like that. It is meant to hold something like well, we can just fill in the blanks, right? It might be meant to draw water from a well, to carry it from one place to another. All sorts of things. It's going to be used for something. But once the shaping is done, at least to a certain point, what's it being used for? What kind of work is it accomplishing? Now, we don't like to think of ourselves as being used. I understand that. That word, especially in our modern context, that's usually a very negative thing, but I would submit that in a sense, it's simply a reality of life. We are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works. In other words, God is using us to do good, if we are in fact allowing Him to do so, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. God can use us and use us for wonderful things if we allow him to do so. But no matter whether or not we allow God to use us for good, we are going to be used by someone for something. Paul is very clear on that in the book of Romans. Do you not know, he says, that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness. Do you know what Paul does not give us as an option in that context? The option to not be slaves. The option to not be doing the work of someone else. We are doing someone's work. And when we boil it down, it's either God's work or it's Satan's work. Those are the only two options. Now, that seems harsh. That seems, I don't like that, but that's the reality that Paul spells out for us. We are being used by someone. And even in a perhaps broader context, God, through others, can use us for good works. Or Satan, through others, can use us for evil. I think about, for example, those who are called deacons in a congregation such as this. Servants, that's literally what that word means. Well, certainly God is using those who are deacons in his service, but also in a sense, the deacons allow the elders to provide oversight and leadership in order to accomplish that very thing. Of course, there's another side to that. There are plenty of people who want to enlist us in their work as well. That might not be good works. That might not be things that are in accordance with God's will. And we might think, oh, well, I'm just doing something for this person. Well, in the grand scheme of eternity, whose work are you doing? Whose work are you doing? Jesus would say, whoever is not with me is against me. Whoever does not gather with me scatters. Again, this is a polarity. We talk a lot at school and places like that about false dichotomies. It's a fancy word that basically just says there's this choice and there's this choice. These are only two choices. Sometimes we do that, and that's not actually true. There might be more than two choices. But there are some circumstances in which there are absolutely only two choices, and this is one of them. Either I'm doing God's work or I'm doing the work of the enemy. We talked about practical ways in which we might be allowing either God or others to shape us. The same is true about being used. Something I've realized recently, I've gone through kind of a weird evolution, I guess, in my own mindset on this. Without going too deep into it, but I've noticed a trend on both sides of the aisle in politics that a lot of people try and use Christians as a voting bloc, as a support for some or another policy, some or another effort. And while I have no interest in talking about specifics, I do want us to be mindful that politicians, political parties, they don't have the same priorities we do. Their interest is not the kingdom of God. We must be careful about being used for something that is not, in fact, what God's will is. Or we might say, those who want to enlist our energy or our efforts to where we dive into something. I love watching Shark Tank. I don't know if anyone ever really liked Shark Tank. I love that show. It takes me back to my business roots, all this kind of stuff. It's just fun. But something that's always interesting when I'm watching that show is how often the sharks emphasize you got to be all in if you are an entrepreneur, if you're running a business. You got to be all in. You can't have, another job and all these distractions. You got to be all in if you're going to succeed. In fact, Kevin O'Leary, the one who's kind of the bad guy in the show, right? He talks about how much he loves money. You got to make money. You got to make a profit. He's doing it to play a character. I understand that. But sometimes I sit there and I think, would I ever want to be someone who was that all in? I'm not saying it's wrong to work hard. I'm not saying it's wrong to be an entrepreneur or build a business. But the only thing I want to be all in on is Jesus Christ. Because nothing else is going to remain after I'm gone. No matter how much work I put into it, no matter how hard I put in my efforts, I want God to be the one using me, and everything else falls under that umbrella. God made us in His image to do good. But Satan can use us to do evil. And once again, we get to choose who's using us. We get to choose whose work we do. We mentioned passive learning or passive shaping. A lot of times what happens is we don't make a choice, and that's exactly when Satan swoops in and just starts using us without us even realizing it. We've got to make the choice. We've got to be intentional. But thirdly, not only does it matter who shapes us, not only does it matter who uses us, it matters who fixes us. We mentioned how fragile a piece of pottery can be. Well, the fact is, we are very fragile as human beings. Not necessarily physically, although in a sense that's true too. God actually designed the body incredibly. But I'm primarily thinking emotionally, mentally, spiritually. We all have times where we become broken, where we struggle, where there's a piece of us that is shattered. And when that time comes, we look for someone to help us, to help piece us back together, to help fix us. We recognize we need that process. We need to be restored. But there's a lot of sources we can go to get that restoration. A lot of sources we can go to that claim to offer restoration. Solomon, as not only the wisest, but the richest man of his day and all the amazing things he had access to, in Ecclesiastes, he talks about all the ways he tried to fill the void in his life. He tried it with wealth. He tried it with women. He tried it with wisdom. He tried it with everything you can possibly think of, and he didn't have any limitations. Literally whatever he could possibly want in his day was his. And you know his conclusion? If I may paraphrase, none of it fixed me. None of it filled the hole in my life. None of it gave me true meaning or purpose. It was all nothing. It was like trying to grab wind out of the air. There are a whole lot of things this world offers as fixes. A whole lot of things that people pursue to try and make themselves feel better after a tragedy, after some awful thing has happened in their lives, after simply a recognition that my life should be more than it is, whatever it might be that brings them to that point. They seek after so many things. There are those who ignorantly offer false solutions. But of course, we even see earlier in Jeremiah, there are those who maybe a little more insidiously offer such solutions. The priests of Jeremiah's day, for example, they have, as he puts it, healed the wound of my people lightly. In other words, they put a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage, right? Saying, peace, peace, there is no peace. Now, I would argue, and I've mentioned this before, we have an amazing opportunity as the church in our world today. Because culture, society emphasizes the need for a cause, the need for purpose, the need for community. That's something people are very vocal about searching for, about looking for, about needing. And Christ offers all that. We have the best purpose any human being could possibly have. The best community, the best sense of belonging anyone could possibly offer. And yet even we, with all that right at our fingertips, as those who have put our faith in Christ, sometimes we still seek to be fixed outside of it. My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, Paul said. Now, by the way, let me make a point here. I'm not saying there is not help for certain things to be found in, for example, medicine, if there's something physical or with mental health or something like that. Or if we're talking about those who can give legitimate advice through things like counseling, we have 2 counselors that work with the Keller congregation, right? Those are good things. Those are positive things if we recognize where they fit. Where is the core of what fixes us? It's Christ. You know, the Japanese, you might be familiar with this, they have a very cool practice when it comes to fixing broken pottery. You might be familiar with this practice. This is a picture of it. Hopefully you can see it fairly well. If a piece of pottery breaks, they will actually go to great pains to reattach everything together. But they won't just use glue or some kind of other cheap adhesive. They will literally melt down gold to bind the pieces of pottery back together. And of course, you realize what the result will be. The fixed piece of pottery is far more valuable now than it was before it was ever broken. Now, we have a problem of sin that has broken us in a very real sense. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But guess what? If we recognize that God's strength is made perfect in my weakness, and we allow Him to do His work through the word that He has revealed, through the community that He has established in the church, we too can be put together even more valuable than we were before. What a beautiful thought. But what happens if instead we seek the Band-Aid? What happens if instead we go out and we find things that simply dull the pain? Whether that be substances, whether that be relationships. Or we listen merely to the world's philosophy, the world's psychology of how to do all this that doesn't put God first. We will still be broken. If the world puts us back together, we'll still be broken. If God puts us back together, not only can we be fixed, but we'll be even better. Not because of us, but because of Him. God has given us the choice. We get to choose who our potter is at the most crucial points in our lives. When we're being shaped, which is throughout our lives. When we're being used, when we allow what God has given us as stewards, as we even mentioned in class, to be utilized towards certain works. And when we need to be fixed, when we need help. At all those times, we get to choose who our potter is. Brethren, it matters. It matters who shapes us, uses us, fixes us. Choose well. God can work with every single one of us at once, unlike a potter who can only do one thing at a time. And He offers it free of charge. He simply asks us to choose well, to make the right choice, to allow Him to do what He needs to do, as we even talked about last week, are maintaining that relationship so that we are giving what He asks in return, which is simply ourselves. The potter, or rather the clay, can't be shaped and molded and used and fixed if it doesn't allow itself to be put in the hands of the potter. So are you going to let yourself be shaped, be used, be fixed by the hands of your Creator? I hope so. And if there is anything we can do this morning to help you, to encourage you, to show you what God offers and what He has done, whether you have not become a Christian or whether you are a Christian and you're struggling, whatever the case might be, we want to study with you, we want to cry with you, rejoice with you. But give us that opportunity, if you will, as we stand, as we sing together.